apologize for my voice. I usually speak to really big rooms and can project all the way back. I have a cold, so I apologize if you can't hear me, but that's okay because I'm only the moderator and your really important folks are going to do all of the speaking today. So I'm State Representative Erin May Quaid, and joining us on the panel today, we have Scott Fay, who is with End Citizens United, and State Senator John Marty from the lower chamber, as we call them in the State House, and Angie Craig, who I hope is our next member of Congress here in CD2. So we're just going to open it up to these folks to talk a little bit. Then I have a prompt question. You're going to be writing some questions down on note cards. I'm going to go through, find duplicates, throw those out, ask those questions after they give remarks. So I'll just kick it off with Senator Marty down there.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to be here, and because of Angie's strong record and plans to help fix government, reform government, it's time to clean up government. I've been fighting for fair and clean elections and taking big special interest money out of politics for 30-some years. And I really like her commitment to the End Citizens United, overturn it, whether it takes a constitutional amendment or whatever. That's basically clarifying what the Constitution, what the founders intended, since some people talk about the founders' intent. There's no way in the world that people intended that powerful interest groups could donate hundreds of millions of dollars to win elections in places they don't even live. Even their corporations don't live in those districts. And so it's urgent we do that. I also like her commitment to the Honest Ads campaign, which will do some things to start making social media cover, the Disclose Act. All those disclosure things are long overdue, and the Supreme Court has said they think disclosure is part of the solution, and it is, but then they've kind of restricted it, so Congress has to step in and be real clear on those things. The contribution refund program that she's interested in exploring at the national level, Minnesota's been doing that for years. It's small individual contributions to take on and counterbalance some of the big money. But the big thing we have to do is get the big money out of politics, and I think Angie Craig represents that and is willing to fight for that. And the big way I'd put it, just to summarize, is November 6th is supposed to be an election, not an auction. It's time we make it an election again.
Yes. Scott, take it away.
Great. My name is Scott Fay. I'm here representing End Citizens United. We are a group of 4 million people across the country, including 6,500 right here in your congressional district. We are very proud to stand with Angie Craig. We've been with her for more than a year now, one of our earliest endorsements. I think before we get into this, how many people in the room feel like the government is working for them and not the special interests? And how many folks feel like the special interests are working? Yeah. So nationally, the polling actually shows that only 7% feel like the government works for them. I don't know who the 7% are. It's probably maybe some of your future colleagues in the Congress that maybe feel like it's working, but it's obviously not working, and really it's gotten exponentially worse since the 2010 Citizens United decision. If you look at the 2008 cycle, which was the last presidential cycle before the decision, the amount of outside money spent in our elections was $144 million, which in and of itself is terrible, right? That is an amount that is just, there's no reason for it, totally unjustified. The only thing worse is in the last presidential cycle in 2016, it was $1.4 billion. So what does that mean? It means that in the previous cycle that 2/3 of all the messaging that was said in campaigns was said by the candidates and the campaigns of the candidates themselves. 1/3 was said by the outside groups. That is now totally flipped. So 2/3 of the things that you see on TV, or you get in the mail, or the phone calls you get, that's all from outside dark money groups. We have no idea where it comes from. We don't know where it comes from because the Citizens United decision said that it's okay for people to spend that kind of money without telling us who they are. So we're here because Angie Craig has committed herself from the very beginning of her campaign to fight for this reform, to be serious about the reform. So serious that in her own campaign, she's not even in Congress yet, and she has already said that she has taken the Honest Ads Act pledge to make sure that her campaign declares on its websites when they do different ads and Facebook ads and things online. She signed and helped lead a letter to Congress that went 2 weeks ago that said that the very first thing Congress does, if these folks make it to Congress, which we know Angie will, the very first thing that they need to do is to do a holistic government reform bill that will get this money out so that then they can turn to immediately do prescription drug prices and jobs in the economy, because there's no other way that we know that they're going to be fighting for us unless we do this first piece first. So I'm really happy to be here today. I'm happy to be with Senator Marty, who is he is the guy. You are very lucky in this state to have him there fighting for you for this reform. So of course, extremely happy to be here with Angie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so honored to be running to represent you as a member of Congress. And as I have run this race, as well as another race, I can tell you that one of the biggest impediments, in this country to getting drug pricing that we can afford, to getting health insurance that Americans can afford, is to get special interests out of our elections. As I've looked at how we can do this, I've tried to set the appropriate example in our own campaign by taking pledges, which I'm sure I'll talk through today. But the other thing that I've tried to do is think through what's a little bit of Minnesota common sense that we could bring to Washington. Because I know Washington needs a little bit more Minnesota common sense. And that's why we invited Senator Marty here today, because he was one of the leaders in legislation that established the political contribution refund program right here in Minnesota. I am so proud that on our campaign this cycle, we have had 132,000 people contribute, an average of $32. And I want every political candidate in this country to look at who's funding their campaign and say, you know what, it's my neighbors funding this campaign. It's people who truly want their values represented in this country. And so as I move forward and run, some of the commitments that I have made is to support the Honest Ads Act, to support the Disclose Act. Look, I work for a company, right? If that company has to report every quarter to the SEC what's going on, if we can't overturn Citizens United, then the best next thing is sunshine and transparency. It's disclosure. It's making sure if large corporations are contributing to super PACs, that we all know it so that we can judge that corporation with our own consumer dollars. We deserve to know who's trying to influence elections. Now, as I have run, I've also seen an enormous amount of reform that needs to happen in what we're doing actually once you get there. And so I don't believe any member of Congress should ever be able to serve as a lobbyist to this country. I don't believe that we should have this revolving door of staffers who become lobbyists and then go to work for members of Congress. We have got to start working on behalf of Americans again. And the first step to do that is to get big money out of politics. So thank you so much for being here.
So before I ask my first question, I just want to give a little background as to why I would ask these three people this question. So Scott here was the chief of staff to the representative who lead authored the Disclose Act, correct? And you're working with Citizens United now. Senator Marty, you have a degree in ethics from the University of St. Olaf, am I right? So I mean, what more do we need to know? But we could also know that he was the person who put through the legislation that means lobbyists and interest groups can't give gifts to legislators. This is something you've been working on your entire career. I always like to tease him because he was elected the same year I was born. And Angie, you know, she mentioned 2 or 3 of the things that she has talked about with her clean campaigns, but she has an entire comprehensive package that she has put forth before she's been elected to how we can get big money out of politics. So we have 3 folks here who don't just think about this sometimes. These are commitments. This is life work that we've done. So to the 3 of you, I will say, and I'll let Scott start in the middle here. What can we do to make campaigns and government more transparent?
Showing up. It's doing what you're doing here today. I think after the 2016 election, we saw this resurgence of community activism, of folks coming out and making their voices heard. I think many people feel like the 2016 election didn't necessarily reflect the way they feel. And we've seen, and as I understand it in meeting Angie earlier in this cycle, that what started as small meetings in different parts of this district have turned into hundreds of people showing up and making their voices heard. And as a former chief of staff myself to a member of Congress, Congressman Cicilline, who was here yesterday actually in Minnesota doing an event with Angie, it's so important. I don't think people realize this. It feels like it's a long way away to make a phone call to Washington, D.C. or send an email. I'll tell you that as a former staffer, it makes all the difference. That when you get that report every week, both the chief of staff and the senior staff and the member, you get that report every week and you see the readout of who's calling in on what. We see it and we pay attention. And it doesn't take that many calls and phone calls to do it. So I think being active and being engaged and demanding that your representatives are working for you, and this is not a partisan issue, by the way. We look at this all the time. It's this, you don't need to be a Democrat or a Republican or anything in between. All of the polling demonstrates this is something that actually the one issue that may be universally that we all agree upon, which is that we need to end this dark money system. And I would just say keep coming to events like this, keep speaking out. It, by the way, doesn't end on November 6th either. That this needs to continue and to stay active and stay involved because people are listening. They really, it feels like they don't, but they are.
Well, you know, after this election season, I think maybe we need to rename the Honest Ads Act because I'm not sure I've seen an honest ad. And at least when people are running these ads on the Super PAC side, we deserve to know whose agenda is at work here. Is it the agenda of the American people or is it the agenda of corporate interest? And I just look at what's happening with healthcare in this country, and that to me is the biggest example. And it's the biggest, campaign finance is the biggest impediment to making sure that we actually fix today's healthcare system. And I remember in May of 2017 in this congressional district, as our congressman would not hold a public meeting. And I remember many of you in this room and elsewhere put together these meetings, really, and invited him and just came forward and told your stories. And you called his office, and he wouldn't take a meeting with you. Well, he's taken $30,000 from pharmaceutical companies who benefited from not negotiating prescription drug costs with Medicare, who benefit from the American Health Care Act. We have to make sure that people in this country have an opportunity to tell their stories instead of just big pharma companies or big health insurance companies having the ability to tell their stories. And one way to do that is to make sure that the big companies do not have a louder voice than you do. And I'm sorry, but those contributions, you know, they in and of themselves, you know, as long as you know where it's coming from, aren't necessarily the problem, but then you turn around and see members of Congress voting for their special interests, voting for the special interest, and won't even meet with you. And so we have to make sure, because of the proliferation of online advertising these days, that you have to disclose everything that you would have to disclose in a television ad, in an online ad, and we are doing that on our campaign here in 2018. You must disclose. We are proactively disclosing who is contributing to our campaign. We make that available right there on our website. That's how you could analyze it and find out 132,000 people have given me an average of $32. My opponent has received about half of his contributions from special interest PACs. And that's just what's disclosed. All the Super PAC money that's flowing in, and I want to be clear about this, for both sides, right? So Democrats have Super PAC money flowing in, Republicans have Super PAC money flowing in. I want 100% disclosure on both sides. Why? Because I think if Americans knew who was funding those, then the funding would go down for them because Americans wouldn't put up with it.
And I'll add that that I like Angie's efforts, the attempt to amend the Constitution to get rid of Citizens United, overturn it, will avoid all of that dark money in the first place, which, and again, she's right, it'll do it for both sides. It's a fairness thing because we don't want the big money talking. So that's the most important thing, is getting the big money out. But like Angie's plans to stop the revolving door where people go from legislator or their staff to lobbying and lobbying to there, we've got to break that revolving door. And the best illustration I can give, it's also a medical one, when Medicare Part D passed 10, 15 years ago, the prescription drug provision, Billy Towson, the Republican chair of the committee that authored the bill with the provision, said U.S. government will buy all the prescriptions that seniors need, but we're not going to negotiate prices. You just tell us what to pay you, which is something supposed to be worth well over $100 billion to the pharmaceutical industry over the number of years. Huge gain for them. The day after the bill passed, he resigned from Congress, took a $1 million a year job as head of pharma, the lobbying association. That's outrageous. Her legislation would stop that. They could never do it. If you're in Congress, you can't become a lobbyist. We've been trying to do the same thing at the state level. She's going to make it happen in Washington.
Great remarks, yes. So I have some questions from the audience here. The first one, and it sounds like someone might be seeing Chief Justice Roberts tomorrow. So the question is, what would you like me, or C.J. Roberts, is that a different person than Chief Justice Roberts? I'm not sure. What would you like me to ask C.J. Roberts tomorrow about campaign finance reform? Start anywhere.
So look, when the 2010 court ruling, Citizens United versus the FEC, came down, what that ruling said was corporations are people and that money is free speech. That was the ruling in that particular case. And what we have to do is think about, well, if money is free speech, we deserve to know who's talking. So I would ask, given that the amount of money being spent in these races from outside groups has gone from $144 million to $1.4 billion, and Scott, I think that number was just from the 2012 election, that the average congressional race has gone from 1 million to about 3 million in that same period of time. Think about for a minute all of the leaders in Minnesota we would have missed out on. People like Paul Wellstone. Who do you think, and I'm saying this as someone who understands, I grew up in a mobile home court. My family didn't have much at all. The reason I can run for Congress is because I had some connections. We don't want that in this country. We don't want the only people who can run for Congress to be people who can raise money. We've got to create a better system in this nation so that people like Paul Wellstone and Hubert Humphrey and others make it into our political leadership system again in this country.
I think that's right. It's actually an interesting time for the court on this issue. The court just below the Supreme Court issued a little bit of a hold on the Citizens United decision. They issued that because we were in this 4-4 period without Justice Kennedy, waiting for the next judge to come on the court. And so at any point after, now that we have a new justice on the court could take it back up again. And because the courts below, one level below, have said, no, we actually do need to see disclosure. The original intention, by the way, of Justice Kennedy when he wrote the Citizens United decision was, yes, there should be unlimited money, which we wouldn't agree with, and I think the people on the panel wouldn't agree with, but Kennedy felt that there would be transparency and disclosure as a result, and that Congress would catch up and mandate through statute that there would be transparency. Well, lo and behold, the Republicans took the Congress in the majority in 2010 and have had the majority, and there's not one Republican that supports this. It's virtually unanimous on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side it's not. And so the question for Chief Justice Roberts is very clearly, I think, look, this is hurting us. This is hurting us as Americans. We can't get access to our own prescription drugs. People are dying because of opioid epidemics, because these companies are being rewarded with profits as our children and loved ones are dying. And please take that in consideration. It is the Roberts Court, after all. Take that in consideration as the court is looking at this.
I don't think I have much to add other than to say the court has made some misjudgments over the years. I mean, the Dred Scott decision, Plessy Ferguson decision, some of those took 60 years to turn over. We can't wait 60 years for Citizens United and Buckley Vallejo, the one in the 1970s that started us down this wrong path. We can't wait 60 years to change it. We have to change it now. And Angie's two-pronged approach, one is to more disclosure and more reforms internally. All those things can happen now, and a constitutional amendment to say that if the court's not going to change it, well, we want to clarify it because that's what the public wants. And again, it's interesting when you say that none of the Republicans in Congress support this, which seems to be true, but I think the public overwhelmingly, 99, this is the kind of thing, everybody says it's wrong. We don't want special interests to run our government. So I think that your two-pronged approach, one, try and amend the Constitution to fix it, and two, to deal with everything we can do short of that in the meantime.
Great answers. I'm going to start with you again, Senator Marty. We'll work our way down. This is a simple question. There's 3 exclamation points at the end, so I'm going to ask it like I think they wrote it. Why aren't we more fierce?
I think we've got to be very clear in what we want. I don't think we have to be mean. I don't think we have to be vicious. I think we have to be firm. And I think we've been trying to. I've been trying to do that in the Minnesota legislature, sometimes against big odds, but in time things change your way. And I think Angie will start from day one in Washington doing that.
I think exactly why we need to send Angie to Washington. We need more fierce people there to take up this fight. I think that we have. I think that it's been a really challenging time as someone that's been living in Washington, and all of you see the same thing. But at the same time, there's a lot that I think that we can be proud of in this room. We did prevent the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which means that people with pre-existing conditions can still get access to health care. We did make sure that there won't be lifetime caps on people getting critical care. So as dark as sometimes it may seem, I think that the fight that folks have brought to the current times has been strong, and we've prevented a lot of damage. But the road is running out, and we need to send people to Washington like Angie who can stand up and get things done and start fighting for us again, because we can't do another 2 years of this.
Well, and that's a great question about why aren't we more fierce, and that's why you've seen so many of the candidates running in 2018 come together before we get ourselves elected to say to leadership in the Democratic Party, we want this to be the very first thing you take up, because we're never going to make progress on Medicare cost. We're never going to make progress on prescription drug cost, healthcare insurance cost. We're never going to make progress standing up to the special interest on any of the issues we care about until we take up the money in politics issue. And I don't know that you've really seen this in prior elections where a group of candidates have said to their party while running, this will be your top priority, because none of us can participate in moving the country forward together until we remove the money in politics. And it's been really an extraordinary effort that you guys have put together, and that frankly organically some of the top candidates around the country running in districts all over the nation, we've been in communication together to say we're going to put pressure on the party to make sure this is the very first thing we do.
That's right. And it's not just districts, in working on this issue. Oftentimes incumbents, when they get this letter, they talk about the issues, these are the deep blue districts that are people are concerned about this. What's so special about this work and about the letter that Angie is talking about that has 107 signers to it, 107 challenger candidates that have said this has to be the very first thing, is that the folks that are on that letter come from the reddest of red districts to the bluest of blue and everything in between. Because again, this isn't a Democrat or Republican issue or a red state, blue state issue. We're all affected here, and everybody agrees on this. The only constituency of folks that don't agree are the Koch brothers and the Republicans in Washington like Mitch McConnell, who benefit from this. Everybody else is getting the change taken out of their back pocket. So that's what's so special, I think, to Angie's point about this class of folks, which is we're past labels, and we're now fully into who are the folks that are going to get to Washington to authentically change the system. In this class of folks that are running, that have the backgrounds they do, business leaders like Angie, veterans and small business owners, and the number of women, you talk about bringing fierce, like we have an incredible group of women that are going to make it to Congress, that are going to bring the change that we finally need. And that's why we're out here talking about these issues, because we know that we've got to keep the pressure on. We've got to make sure that people back in Washington understand that we're not messing around here this time. These people are demanding it, and it has to be the first thing that we take up.
This actually leads really well into our next question. I'm going to switch it up for each of you because I think you're going to have a unique perspective to each. So the question is, you'll probably need Republican support to get any reforms passed. How do you get them on board? But I want to start with you, Scott, because you worked, you're chief of staff for the representative who authored the Disclose Act. What did that look like? Was there Republican support? Tell us more about that.
Sure. The short answer is no on the last question, which was that, this system, and unfortunately, I just said that Americans across the country feel very strongly that we need to unrig this system. Unfortunately, it's very clear to Republicans elected in Congress that we cannot unrig the system. It very clearly benefits them. There's a money advantage on that side. We see every day these sort of daily infusion of money from dark groups and billionaires that, if you look at the Sheldon Adelson, who I'm sure many of you folks in the room have heard the name, infusing millions of dollars into these campaigns. Well, guess what? In January, February of this year, when the tax bill passed, that amount of money that he's infused in the campaigns over these last several cycles is a drop in the bucket to what he just got back in a corporate tax return. And so the system has changed entirely for Sheldon Adelson and the Koch brothers and other folks, but it hasn't changed for the folks that are working hard day in, day out for wages that seem to get smaller and smaller. So unfortunately, it's known politically that this does favor the other side. Having said that, I think that we have a lot of reason to be optimistic, because I think that this election is going to send an enormous message in the way that in 1994, the other side, I think, sent a message with the Contract of America, and I think that the 2006 election on the Democratic side, we sent a message and did many, many, many things the first 100 hours of that period of time, where we increased the minimum wage and we got the 9/11 Commission finally passed. I think there's another opportunity here where if you're sitting and heading into a 2020 presidential election cycle, if you're sitting in some of these districts as a Republican and you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, I know that voters across the spectrum think this way, and I need to do something. I can't, I'm gonna get thrown out. They're coming after me next. So I think there's some optimism.
Can I ask a follow-up? What was the response when they didn't want to join the bill, didn't want to be a co-author? What do they say?
Ignore it, yeah.
They don't respond.
Yeah.
They don't want to respond because they're embarrassed to say they're on the other side of it. But I think in terms of picking up those Republican votes, first of all, if you're in the majority, you want to pick up their votes, but you can pass things without it. But frankly, a lot of the folks who are in swing districts, when you start talking about this, the public says, yeah, we want it. And the public is very vocal about this at a certain point. And all of a sudden, a lot of those swing district Republicans start saying, well, okay, we better do it, because they're scared of their own seats. So I think you will pick up some, but I don't think you have them now. I think you only pick them up if you get the national discussion, which requires the majority to be talking about it.
And when you passed your bill, did you have Republicans on it? Did they join?
They did in the end. I mean, sometimes they oppose it all the way, and then when the final vote comes, okay, we'll vote for this because we don't want to be seen voting against it. The gift ban, the public officials not being able to get gifts from lobbyists and special interest groups, that thing passed the Senate with, I think, unanimous, or two no votes in the House and the Senate combined. Lots of people voting for it hated it, but they voted for it because they were scared of the public pressure. So I think the same thing will happen. You get these reforms there, you get them on the thing, and you have a significant number of Republicans who will be, they know what the public feels, they'll be scared to vote against them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. To the previous question about fierce, and to this question about how do you get Republicans on board, you got to beat them at the ballot box, right? We've got to win elections. That's the bottom line, is we have to win these swing district seats. And once they understand that the people in places like the 2nd Congressional District are not going to put up with a member of Congress who's prioritizing special interest over their own constituents, who's listening to special interest more than their own constituents, then I tell you what, these swing district Republicans are going to start to have a little bit different attitude about the kind of reform we need. And to your point just a second ago, Scott, I always laugh when I get the question about, corporate PACs. Corporations do not give to Democrats by and large who are challenger candidates. Why is that? Well, because I don't want the $1 trillion that we just spent in this country on tax breaks for corporations. I want those dollars for the middle class and folks who are working hard every day to get a bigger tax cut. So, it's tough when you're talking about corporations, because frankly, they are giving to my opponent because they know I would prioritize the middle class and small businesses over large corporations in this country. And as long as we have those conflicts, then it's going to be tough to pass that legislation. But the playing field is not level. I mean, you know, the other question about being fierce is if you are being outspent 4-1 when you include all the super PAC spending in your race, then it is really tough for a candidate who has the responsibility of disclosing all her donors, you know, her messaging, exactly the facts, you know, you can't tell an untruth, and then super PACs can come in and just say anything they want to, in addition to spend unlimited money, and we don't know where it comes from. That is not a level playing field for politics in this country, and it's not.
So this next question is, what are your thoughts about shortening election campaigns? And I think it can be part of a larger question of, if you could redesign the way we not only do campaigns, but finance campaigns, what would that pie in the sky ideal world look like? Senator Marty, I'm sure you have a bill.
Yeah, I've had one over the years. Taking all the big money out. Elections, if somebody's gonna own our elected officials, it ought to be the public, not the interest groups. Public financing. After the Ross Perot election, 1992, his group, United We Stand America, they had all these older folks. They looked like the Tea Party of newer days, but they were all at the Capitol. They were supporting my bill to ban all PAC and lobbyists and soft money and everything else. I said, but I only want your support if you'll support public finance money to replace it. In other words, some of your money going to support candidates, political candidates, including some you don't like. I said, but you got to do that if you're going to do it. They came back an hour later and said, we unanimously endorsed the bill, including the public financing. So you've got to take all the money out and replace it with public finance money. And realistically, that really does change things. You get that kind of commitment. We're going to take out the big money. We're going to replace it with a fair amount of money. That way you can shorten the elections too. If the public finance money kicks into the candidates who qualify, which would have to be by either a number of petitions or small $5 or whatever contributions they get. In other words, once you qualify for it, if you don't get the checks until 6 months before the election, you're not going to be spending all this money there, because that's when the money comes in. So the only way we can shorten elections, the Supreme Court says we can't stop people from talking about politics anytime. But that's why you have perpetual election cycle. With a clean money system, you could actually shorten elections, and that's part of the benefit of it as well.
Yeah, that's the challenge of reform, right? As long as you have unlimited money that super PACs and corporations can contribute when you're running for Congress to run against you, it creates a perpetual cycle where the candidate herself must fund and run and raise money year-round just to be able to combat the messaging being put up by the super PACs. So, you know, the super PACs create a cycle where, you know, you've probably seen 60 Minutes in the call room, and members of Congress spending a number of hours per week actually raising money. And the challenge is, when you're up against that kind of outside super PAC money machine, boy, if you haven't raised the money to get your message out, it is very hard to be competitive in a congressional race in today's day and time, especially in a swing district like this.
That's exactly right. Unfortunately, as troubling it is as Americans watch these ads in the last several months, and it seems like they're sort of perpetually up now, it's nowhere near as sort of troubling as what the reality is, which is that members of Congress, like Angie said, after they're elected, have to almost immediately, meaning like literally the next week, start calling again. And on a day-to-day basis, on their schedules, they have to be in the call time room for anywhere from 3 to 6 hours a day, depending on the district you're in. And so you're like one of these magazine sales folks or whatever, you name it, where you're calling and asking people for money all day long. And so putting aside the effect that you know, most often this is, you know, can be regular individuals, or it could be PACs or whatever, putting aside that part of it, of what do those people sometimes, what are they looking for, and just get to the pure fact of the matter that that member of Congress isn't working on the issues that they were sent there to work on for you. And they're not in their office working with their staff to craft legislation or going to hearings. They have to skip these hearings where really important things are being talked about because they're too busy in the call time room. And I think the sort of worst effect of all of that
is it means they're not on the floor working with the other party to figure out where you can find compromise. And it's why we're finding ourselves increasingly in our own corners of the room, because each party is in a call time room all day and they're not talking to each other to get things done. So there's so many things that we can do just by getting rid of this dark money piece of it, where instead of going up against the $1.4 billion that was spent last cycle, it'll get more transparency to bring that number down and get them out of the call time room. And there are a number of things that we could do once they're out of the call time room, including public financing. And that'll be part of should the Democrats take the House, there is a public financing component that's under consideration. That would be a match system, that people would be matched, regular voters would be matched up to $200 what they put in, the federal government would match that. And the way that we look at it is either the wealthiest and biggest corporations can own our elections, or each taxpayer could pay $3.50 a year, would be what the cost would be, to fund our elections as people-powered elections. That's the choices.
I think a lot of people would rather pay $3.50 a year and ban all those TV advertisements.
I think if you just let people opt in, we could raise enough money, right?
And the other thing on the call time thing, I think that's one where you might actually pick up some Republicans. After that 60 Minutes thing, Rick Nolan from Minnesota, DFLer, and a Florida Republican had put together a bill banning that would propose that members of Congress could not fundraise directly. They simply could not do so. And they said how, Rick Nolan said he served in Congress in 1970. He said the biggest change was back then Congress worked. These days Congress is told, the new members in competitive districts are told, he said, like 20 hours a week of call time you're expected. He said both parties do it. Keep thinking, we want to send Angie Craig to Washington to work for our interests, not to spend time on the phone, which is what the system has forced people, both parties, to do. So I think that's one of the areas where you might pick a few Republicans, because everybody hates it. It's a sick way of running a government, and it's got to stop.
Absolutely.
So I think this cold stings. So I think you all touched on it from different perspectives, and so I'd love to hear maybe some of the unintended consequences of, or things that we wouldn't think of, like as a candidate, we wouldn't think how big money in politics would affect you by spending 20 hours of call time. Or so tell me more about some of the things we might not think of that affect your lives, or maybe it affects our lives and we're not aware of it because it's such a big problem. And start anywhere.
Well, I think it impacts the amount of time that members of Congress can spend with constituents, whether that's in Washington, whether that's in Minnesota. If you have 20 hours of your week scheduled for fundraising, then that is 20 hours less a week that you can spend time talking and listening to your constituents. And so, I guess now we all understand where Jason's been for 2 years.
Call time room.
I think that's right. And the other thing that, as Democrats and Republicans are thinking about the elections that are coming 2 years away, and all the money that's, after this election, all the money that's going to be coming at them with these super PACs, they have to be thinking in the back of their mind all the time, what are the ways that I can constantly be bringing additional money in so that I can at least arm myself up to protect myself against what will be this big money that's out there. And one of the ways in the current world that we live in that they do that is they say increasingly hyperbolic things about the other side, about the other party, about the previous presidential candidates, because when they say it, whether it's on the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate or in a TV interview, their finance person can immediately take that clip and send it out to their email list and run up a bunch more money in grassroots money. At least it's grassroots money, but it encourages hyperbolic communication so that people can arm up their war chest in order to defend themselves, ironically, against this super PAC cycle. It's a vicious cycle.
And I'd say the biggest things that affect the public are, one, the impact. Angie said earlier that if we don't take care of the campaign finance system, we can't pass health care reform, can't pass education reform, we can't deal with transportation, any of the needs, because the special interests got their heavy thumb down on the scale, tilting it their way. So you've got to do it for that way. But the second one is the call time. I think most people are shocked that they're members of Congress. People they're sending there to represent them are spending 20 hours a week on the phone. You try 20 hours for 1 week. Tell me if you think that's a good way to spend your time. and they're talking just to people who are trying to get something out of government. So we've got to stop that, and I think Angie's reform package will help make that happen.
Look, the likelihood of a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United is very low. Even if we could get the votes there, the idea that it would get the ratification by the states is really unrealistic at this moment in time. We know that, which is why you hear us talking about transparency, disclosure, putting the information in the arms of consumers to make a good judgment of whether the companies that they're spending their money with are appropriately behaving in the political environment. And so, you know, I think for at least the medium term, that is the best approach to actually change what is happening in this country. And there will always be people like very large donors who are prioritizing what they want to see the government do by giving hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, we're talking about, you know, $200 million from large investors in the political process. And I'm using the word investor for a reason. They are investing in the outcomes that they are wanting, whether that be tax reform for a corporation or for, you know, someone in the top 10%. They are investing in what they want in this Congress. And frankly, the way we combat this, the way we actually change this in the short term is by winning elections, by each of you getting involved and saying, you know, it may take 1 million of us to combat the $1 million that's going in against my opponent, but we are all going to be involved in the process, whether that's the, you know, $32 someone put into my campaign, or the $2 that someone put into my campaign. It all really, really matters in the end to have your voice heard.
Absolutely.
This question was specifically for Scott. Are there models in other states you'd like to see on a national level?
The senator could probably answer that better than me, but
Take it away.
yeah, New York I know has a great system that folks, when they were beginning to implement, put up flags and they didn't like it, and the folks that were incumbents complained about it, and now fast forward a few years now and it's working great. But
And I'd say Minnesota has had some good laws since the 1970s, the post-Watergate reforms, and they're slowly getting weakened because of the outside money coming in. You didn't used to have parties dumping in huge sums of money in independent expenditures. Our laws didn't allow it. The Supreme Court said you can do it. So our laws are getting worse, but there are a lot of good things, and Angie's picked up one of them, the refundable contributions we have, which makes it so people who can't afford to give a penny to a candidate now because they're struggling to make ends meet, if they can give $50 and get it refunded, it gives them a small voice to say that's not the end result, as Angie said. You know, taking out the big money is not going to happen tomorrow. So in the meantime, you do these little things along the way, and her package of disclosure things is a huge thing. Again, disclosure is not sufficient, but when it's the best you can do, you do it, and that's why I really appreciate your commitment to making that happen.
It takes disclosure, but then it's going to take all of you to react to that disclosure, right? So we need to know what the information is, who's funding the dark money in campaigns, and then voters can do with that what they wish.
The questions are over there on those note cards. Thank you very much. All right. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip to the bottom of this question. It's about the fairness doctrine and corporate ownership of media like Fox News. How do we talk about big money in our media that is impacting our politics? It's a big question, but I like it. Scott?
sure. Angie mentioned this a second ago. The folks that are contributing, she mentioned pharmaceutical companies, when they're looking to make those types of PAC contributions, it's not out of charity. It's out of a semblance of there's got to be an ROI there, right? Otherwise, they would be not holding responsibility to their stakeholders and shareholders. So there are reasons those types of investments, and she used the word investment, those investments happen. What we've seen in the last 2 years under the Trump administration, in terms of the number of mergers and monopolies that have been created, And your senator here, Senator Klobuchar, has been in the forefront of fighting against a lot of those mergers. But what we've seen is these conglomerates form in all different areas, different sectors. And I think it's something that not just as it relates to telecom and cable TV and media writ large, but in general, you know, there's a reason why we didn't live through the sort of post-19th, early 20th century that Teddy Roosevelt decided we needed to change those things, that we should have broken up companies, that no one benefits when only one or two companies own everything. So I think it's another reason why we need to bring change to Washington, and we need to bring people that are going to stand up and say, wait a minute, what's going to be in the best interests of the voters in Minnesota, not what's in the best interests of these multi-billion-dollar multinational companies.
And the fairness doctrine is something should never have been taken away. It was very important to our democracy. We lose those. Can we get some of those things back? Perhaps. These media mergers, I mean, that's really hugely a problem, because these folks have access to everybody, and a lot of them, like Rupert Murdoch, have it because they have an agenda they want to get across. And fair is not what they're interested in. They're interested in more for them, and they try and strategize to help their political causes. So I think the more we can stop the big mergers, the more, even things like net neutrality. I mean, who owns the internet? Who controls what we see? All those things are huge fairness issues, and it all ties to the big money in politics, and that's why this is an issue. It's not anybody's most important issue, but in another sense, it's everybody's most important issue, because it affects every other issue Congress talks about.
So this question is for Angie. How would you be campaigning differently if Citizens United was overturned?
Ooh, that's a great question. Look, if we didn't have millions and millions of dollars coming in against us in outside money, I wouldn't need to raise as much money as I've had to, and therefore I could have spent a lot more time talking with the people of this district. I could have spent a lot more time talking to people like John Marty about policy. That's the biggest sort of farce when someone runs for public office at the federal level. Is sort of there's this belief that, you know, you're sitting around thinking about, you know, what are the great policies, and let's study the bills and that sort of thing, right? I mean, that's what we want our future representatives doing, talking to you, starting to pin out some sort of roadmap to legislation for things like this. But instead, we have to spend so much time in other activities called fundraising. And the irony of the media question you asked just a moment ago is, you think about all this money that we have to raise, the millions of dollars that I've had to raise over the last 14 months while running for Congress. Guess where all that money, or the majority of it, is going? TV media, cable and broadcast. Most of those stations make the profits that they make over a 2-year period of time during election season. And, you know, they're in heaven right now because of all of the competitive races we have in Minnesota. So, you know, the question is, you know, who's making money off this? And it's the local TV broadcast in all of these competitive districts around the country. And then the irony of it is, these same stations can then turn around and throw unlimited money into super PACs to achieve whatever their interests are.
Mind-blowing. So this, again, is for Angie. Has your opponent agreed to debates? And if so, would you be able to discuss that in the debate? I mean, I know you've been standing in at town halls for him.
I invite Jason Lewis to join me in support of a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have agreed. Well, let me start with, Jason missed an opportunity to debate me at Farm Fest, the Congressional Forum. He was a no-show. Jason missed the opportunity to debate me in Northfield with a group of faith leaders about where we go next with healthcare. We have agreed to debate on Almanac this Friday night, live. We have agreed to debate on October 25th. It's sponsored by the Dakota County Chamber of Commerce, as well as Dakota County Technical College. So it will be at DCTC. And then finally, we have debated, it has not been shown yet, on KSTP, and that will air, I think, on the 21st of the month. So they were pre-recording debates on KSTP. So we will have 3 debates, the same amount that we did in 2016, and I'm really sorry Jason passed up a couple of other opportunities to talk about critical issues with me already.
Yeah. Scott, what are some opportunities candidates have to bring up this issue when they don't get to control the questions, they don't get to control the follow-up? How can we work this into some of the big, bread and butter issues that we talk about in campaigns?
Sure, yeah. So I think for the reasons we've given in this conversation so far, it is the base issue, right? If we're thinking about why do we feel like the cost of prescription drugs go up every other week, if we think about why the tax bill that passed benefited the top wealthiest and benefited corporations and not the rest of us, if we think about why we continue to try and fight to clean up our environment and seemingly nothing changes, it's because there is a rigged system, and the 7% of America, the 93% of Americans who understand that special interest control that system, they're onto something. And so I think regardless of whatever the topic is, healthcare parity and jobs and even immigration, really it comes down to sort of the quintessential question for a lot of things in life: show me the money. Where is it coming from? And why is it being spent? And I think those are questions you can ask in any context.
Senator Marty, in your op-ed, you talked about how this issue kind of gets hidden, right? When we were in the legislature and they tried to repeal the personal contribution refund, there's never an outcry, right? We don't see it on the front page of the Star Tribune. How can we talk about this in a way that does become more highlighted, and what have you done in the past to do that?
I think one of the things you do is you have to be real clear on it. The public this is one of those issues. Common Cause did a poll in Minnesota about late 90s, I think it was, on whether you thought that members of Congress who get money, or politicians who get money from special interests, are more receptive to their donors than they are to their constituents. It was close. I think it was 88-2. Something like that kind of mark, I think 88-2, saying that, yeah, they think members of Congress and politicians pay more attention to the big donors. And the public hates that. The only reason they don't get much attention is, well, the media doesn't play it up much, and so nobody hears about it, and so nobody does. You have to keep pounding away at it. And it's not like all of a sudden you're going to have everybody paying attention to it. You have to keep using it every time. That's why an agenda like Angie's helps to talk about this. You can't just say, well, yeah, I mean, even if she didn't talk about this, even if it wasn't on her webpage, even if her agenda wasn't out there, she might do that stuff anyway, but you got to talk about these. You got to let people know what you're planning to do. And I mean, it's actually bizarre that you have to do this, but when you commit to saying you're going to have regular town meetings, I mean, that shouldn't be something we have to get a candidate to commit, but she sees incumbents who don't do that and recognizes that people are beginning to doubt that they have a right to ever talk to their elected officials. Yep. And so she's saying, hey, we're not going to do it the way they do it. We're going to do it our way. We're going to meet with people regularly. But every time you can, you have to raise these. Yeah, people are going to talk about taxes and environment and healthcare and everything else, but fundamentally this issue, which they won't otherwise think about, affects all of them, and that's why I really appreciate your raising this and highlighting the issue.
Go ahead.
Well, you go ahead.
Well, so my final question, I believe, I want to start with you, Angie. I want to end with you, because I want to go Scott and John. I want you to talk about what messaging works. What has research shown us? What has polls shown us? What have people been most receptive to? How can we distill this down in a very understandable way when we're talking to folks? And then when we end with Angie, I want you to talk about, as you've talked about this, what has the response been? What have folks said to you, and what have they found most compelling about your plan?
Yeah, fortunately, unlike a lot of issues that are hard to talk about and think about, like healthcare, I get lost pretty easily myself when I try to even pick my own health plan. But when you talk about this issue, it's very simple. The government feels rigged right now. Whether that's true or not is another question, but it feels rigged, and the perception is it's rigged. And we need fighters to get to Washington to fix it. And it's as simple as that, and that's a message that we saw in the 2000 campaign, worked on both sides, frankly. I would say it worked on the other side a little bit differently, but it's something that voters intuitively understand. They understand that this system is not working for them, that it is working for the special interests at the top.
and that it's rigged against them, and it explains why the cost of everything they need are going up, and why their wages seemingly aren't. So it's fairly simple.
And Scott's done polling on what messages work best and so on, but yeah, I think it's one that even the worst messages on trying to say take the big money out of politics, even the worst messages are overwhelmingly popular. They all sell well, and the bottom line is the public knows the system's rigged. I think a lot of people voted for Trump somehow thought he was going to unrig the system instead of rig it to the hilt. But they understand it. They understand it's a problem, and I think good phrases, I think, matter. That's why I keep saying November 6th is supposed to be an election, not an auction, because it is.
I would just end, Aaron, by saying that, you know, someone running for public office can stand up here, sit up here and say, this is what I would sponsor or vote for. What I've tried to do in this election is also say, I make you the commitment, whether it ever becomes law or not, that I will never, ever register as a lobbyist and lobby based on my service and commitment to serve you. Because we've got to do more than talk. The American public has lost confidence in its government. They have lost confidence in their government. And if we don't send people to Washington, frankly, who are going to stand up sometimes to their own party and say, I'm not moving one more step until we get campaign finance reform done, because everything else depends on this. So what I will tell you is I've tried to step forward and voluntarily say, I'm going to do it whether the rest of Congress does it or not. I'm going to listen to my constituents, and that means I'm probably going to get yelled at by some of my constituents. But you know what? That's the job. If you don't want the job, get out of the job. If you don't want the job, this has been the longest job interview of my life, let me put it that way. And what I can tell you is I know what the job is. It's to represent you. So thank you so, so much for being here today.